Speaking of reliability, a podcast with good friends talking with you about reliability engineering topics. Welcome to Speaking of Reliability. This is Fred Schenkelberg.
And this is Chris Jackson, and we're going to be talking today about the MTBF. Fred really wanted to talk about it. He hasn't spoken about it for at least 3 minutes, so we had to get back onto it.
Well, I had to run downstairs and get a different coffee mug. I have a no MTBF coffee mug, so I can stay grounded. You made this bold statement. It's that sometimes it's useful. Okay. Mm-hmm. Technically, you're correct. There's no doubt about it. Mm-hmm. It is a number. It's calculating an average. And every now and then in a wild blue moon, maybe the average is actually useful. But I've run into gamesmanship, weird, manipulations and jumping up and down and bold assumptions and misinterpretations. And that list just goes on and on and on. That even if it is an accurate representation and a useful measure for some particular aspect of whatever you're doing, the chances are that only 1 in 5 people that ever see that number in its context will actually interpret it correctly. Is kind of where I come down on it. It's, a number is a number. We can calculate an average, and we've been doing that since, early on in our education. And the issue is that it comes burdened with so many falsehoods that many people don't even realize. And right. So they drive on thinking it's a normal distribution and it's 50 percentile, and off we go. And then they make irrational decisions because of that.
Right. And I think, one of the ways we try to convey what the MTBF is and isn't is with analogies. And an analogy I might try and use, I should say. I won't bring you down with my sinking ship, potentially. But it's the health of human beings. We all have different ideas about what healthy is. But they tend to cluster around a few central themes. And one way of measuring health is through weight, what your mass is. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very important to talk about numbers that are what we call indicators. And indicators are essentially, for lack of a better term, statistics, which may or may not have a correlation with what's actually going on in a good way. So, manufacturing facility, one indicator is the ratio of corrective maintenance to preventive maintenance, or the ratio of unplanned maintenance to planned downtime. Some will say, well, that's supposed to be a ratio of 6-1 or what have you. Mm-hmm. That's an indicator. There is no direct link between that indicator and an optimal manufacturing facility. It doesn't mean there's not potentially some value in that indicator if you've got a lot of really smart, really experienced people who've tried different things over the years, and in their experience, genuinely, a ratio of 6-1 represents optimal conditions. But I too often see so-called indicators being used as if they are the law or the answer, and mainly because someone heard that number from somewhere else or listened to a podcast and said, okay, it has to be 6-1, otherwise it's all bad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So bringing it back to human health, one indicator is mass. But even then, some people with exactly the same mass can have very different levels of health. Someone who is 220 pounds, but is 6'6", would potentially be much healthier than someone who is 220 pounds or 5'2". Mm-hmm. The height is also something which comes into play. And even identically, people with identical heights, if you work out a lot and try hard to grow your muscles, you're going to naturally have higher muscle mass and be heavier without that necessarily being detrimental to your health. In fact, you might be healthier than most people. But if you have a higher than average mass, and that's because of subcutaneous fat, then you're not as healthy. And I think the only time I would advocate the MTBF as being useful is when it's used as an indicator. So if you look at a manufacturing facility, if you look at how many failures you have in January, say, let's just say you have 10 breakdowns in January, just so
Mhm.
10 failures per month, and you work hard to improve it, then by the end and December that year, you have on average 3 failures per month. That's awesome. But that is a measure of the MTBF. And in January, the MTBF was 1/10 of a month. In December, it's 1/3 of a month. So you've increased the MTBF by a factor of three, which is unambiguously good.
But even just comparing 10 to 3
Hmm.
is an equivalent one that's kind of hard to misinterpret.
I agree. But then I think what we I don't think we disagree in terms of when you have the acronym MTBF anywhere in a document or an organization's lexicon, it's been our experience that as a rule, that MTBF spreads throughout the entire organization like a contagion. And so everything then gets measured as an MTBF from top to bottom, as opposed to it just being an indicator at the top. Is that a fair call?
Yeah, and that's kind of my. There's nothing wrong with the number. It's an inverse of the failure rate, right? We have a fixed, say we normalize it to a
Mm-hmm.
30-day month, then yeah, it's fine. And yet you take easy to interpret numbers, 10 failures per month versus 3 failures per month. I don't need any other information to go, oh, it's better. Now, in the actual situation, I would also want to know, well, those 3 failures, did they take us down for 3/4 of the month? Were they
I
major
agree.
failures? Were they minor failures? And so on. Is that kind of even as an indicator? Now, one of my first thoughts about using it as an indicator, I was working with a group years ago, and we are looking at field data. We were trying to use their past history for an upcoming product that was pretty similar. And so it was a good amount of the same technology, the same basic design and approach and so on. And they were updating a few things in it. So I thought, well, let's use your field data to get an idea of where you're at and what we need to improve or what do we need to pay attention to, or all the types of things of how are we doing. And they hadn't really done that before. So we put it on a CDF plot. Basically just just a first look, what's this stuff look like, time to failure data. And there was a cluster that was in the first couple of months, and there was a cluster out at about 2 years. There's two different. It was very odd. It wasn't like they had failures at a regular cadence. It wasn't a dominant failure mechanism, and they hadn't done a whole lot of failure analysis and so on. They pretty much, the team I was working with was pretty much design it, throw it over the wall, and don't try not to ever think about it again. Was one of their flaws, to be frank.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, what are these failures? Let's figure out what these early cluster things are, because early failures cost you more, the brand loyalty and all the other stuff. We had that discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And, oh, we can fix that. And so they did. And about 6 months later, I get a call from them and saying that their MTBF values from one of their major customers was getting worse. The new product was much worse. And he said, but I don't understand. We fixed, a big chunk of what was causing our past problems. And what happened is that the early failures flattened out the slope, right?
Right.
So the MTBF, which is out at the 63rd percentile on a Weibull plot, was, I don't know, say 100. I don't know what the exact numbers were. It was out.
Now
But,
that's not the MTBF. We'll get some irate statisticians coming in that with the
oh,
characteristic
I know, but
life.
it's a characteristic life, right? And
Yep.
we can calculate an MTBF off of that. And see, I'm just don't use it so often. I don't even care to calculate it.
Ah.
But
All right. Yep.
but what you get is you get a number that's 100, and then I take care of a bunch of early failures. And now the slope of that curve tilts, think of it as counterclockwise. And because now I have a more a higher beta value single failure mechanism that happens out a couple of years from now. And now they were getting 80 as their characteristic life. And it's like, it's not worse because you don't have the failures in the first couple of months. But if your customers are looking at it as, what's your overall MTBF, they're looking at a number that's way out there that we only been making this product for 2 years kind of thing. And it's like, and part of it was commingling two different products. There's one with before the fix and after the fix. And so, but it had the effect of tilting, reducing the characteristic life, and hence also the MTBF value they were calculating, or the MTTF in this case. But there's so many artifacts of using it as an indicator that you just need to get a bit more data, more information, you need the slope, basically.
Oh, I completely agree, but it's still, I mean, when we're trying to explain to people the MTBF is bad and we just say, don't use it, even though I think you've admitted that, hey, look, at 10 failures in January is obviously worse than 3 failures in December. But engineers being naturally curious, even if they're not being malicious, say, well, okay, well, that's another way of saying that the MTBF went from 3 days to 10 days. I mean, I'm just looking at the same number just from a different angle. Why is it bad? But looking at it in terms of the failures per month, the inverse is okay.
Yeah, it's a mathematical function. It reveals. It's just like, I totally agree. It's just another way to represent a number, and marketing folks tend to really like it because it gets big quickly. Instead of reducing failure rates, which inherently conveys a negative connotation, we're dealing with failures. Well, we've got the mean time to failure is getting longer, it's getting bigger, so up and to the right is always good. And it's also not very informative, but okay, whatever.
But the example you're talking about is, where you're talking very specific failures. That's sort of where the MTBF becomes completely useless, down in the weeds. And an example we'll use is a ball bearing. I mean, often a lot of plants have big ball bearings, like big ones, not little ones that you get in door handles,
bicycle hub, yeah.
We're talking, state of the art componentry. Let's just call it that. Big, extraordinarily well machined and designed bearings. But a ball bearing will have an MTBF of, let's just say, 5 million cycles. I'm just making one up. Yeah. That's not an unrealistic one. Mm-hmm. Depending on the loads involved, it would be shorter. Depending on the type of ball bearing, if you're thrust bearing, roller bearing, it'll change. But let's just say that the MTBF is 5 million cycles on it, roughly. Now, if you run your ball bearing to failure, then the MTBF will be 5 million cycles, and that could be 3 months worth of operations. Let's make it easy. Say every month is 1 million cycles, so 5 months worth of operations.
All right.
If you decide to replace your ball bearing at the B5 life, where essentially
every month
you get it won't be quite. No, not quite, because the B5 life isn't just. But yeah, it's going to be shorter than every month. Maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever.
Yep.
You are going to have a ball bearing which you swap out. Throw what was once working with a brand new one in, but at least you know why you're doing it. You have no or you limit. There'll be still some ball bearings that fail because statistics just permit that to be possible. But you'll have a lot fewer failures, even though the ball bearing itself still, if it was allowed to run to failure, would exhibit an MTTF or MTBF of 5 million cycles.
Right. Now, and I think you even did a whole webinar on it one time saying, if you actually look at the time to failure data, say on a Weibull distribution or something else, then you could, instead of assuming that it's constant failure rate with only an MTBF value. And you actually know what the bearings are almost always 2 to 3 is a beta, somewhere in there. Not always, but if you know what it is, then you've got a much more accurate picture of when the B5 is. And then you can do the cost benefit trade-off saying, well, when is it that we will have an unacceptable number of failures with attendant costs to them versus throwing away perfectly good bearings?
Right.
That part often gets missed. What I see in MTBF type stuff, it goes, oh, it's 50,000 hours. The number one issue I run into is, they will all last at least 50,000 hours. And it's like,
yep.
What? What are you talking about?
But that's a separate issue. That's where people don't do statistics well.
Yeah.
But then the other option is that instead of having a fixed interval servicing, you have condition-based maintenance where you have a sensor on those ball bearings, and 99% of ball bearings fail due to spalling, which can have all sorts of different root causes. But long story short, you start having metal flaking away.
Yeah, you can hear it or you can feel it with the sensitive device on certain bearings. You can really see it. But just do that instead.
Right, and which means that the same ball bearing, which if it was allowed to run to failure would still have an MTBF of 5 million cycles, but now you are actually eliminating all. You can't see the air quotation marks. You can never truly eliminate all, but you'll eliminate the overwhelming majority of failures for a ball bearing which still has an MTBF of 5 million cycles. So where the component MTBF hasn't changed, the way you either run that thing to failure or have fixed interval replacement or have condition-based maintenance will drastically influence the effect that thing has on your plant's MTBF as an indicator.
Yeah. See, I still think, the plant manager doesn't care about MTBF, really doesn't. They want uptime. They want systems running and it's making products and it's making them well. Now, different plants will do different deals, and MTBF is only one aspect of that, which is hence that earlier example of 10 to 3 is like, well, if those 3 cost me more hours of unscheduled downtime than the 10 did, I'd rather have the 10.
Right.
And we talk about this all the time when we get a question is, well, what question are you trying to answer? What decision are you trying to make? It's the same if the metric or the measure or the indicator is one true, it gives you a clear picture of what's going on and is helpful for you to make decisions. Yeah, I'm fine with that. There's just too big of an asterisk on this going, well, it's just, and I've told you this story is I was at a conference and I got asked a question about, what do you do with somebody that doesn't understand MTBF? What it really means or what it is. And what do you mean? He says, well, failure-free period. Oh yeah, I heard that before. And I think I had 150 reliability type people in the room. And I don't remember what I was there to talk about. It was all queued up on the computer. And I had, I think, an hour and a half, or I had a good 45 minutes, I think it was. I had a good chunk of time. And I asked, I just got this question. I was wondering if anybody else has this question. Anybody run into a situation where the supplier or the colleague or the manager, anybody that really didn't understand what MTBF was? Every single hand went up. And so I threw away my presentation, got a piece of paper, we had a chalkboard or a whiteboard or whatever it was. And we started listing all the ways people had misunderstood this stuff. And we had a great time. And the handlers in the back of the room were just wringing their hands and jumping up and down and wanting me to get onto the presentation. I said, they can read that later. But it cinched for me that the misunderstanding part is, there are niche applications, there are circumstances. The calculation of the value isn't a crime. It's the inverse of a failure rate. It's the average. It's, whatever. It's the dealing with the fundamental thing of it might be a normal distribution underneath that, and it might be the 50th percentile. It's very likely not in the world that we live in, dealing with time to failure data. Um, and then this litany of ways people just don't ask the next question. I got a number, I'm good. And it becomes gospel at that point. And it's the only thing they want. And it's like, so that's the frustrating part for me is our education system. And I've confronted professors and educators in reliability world that teach the 4 functions, CDF, PDF, all those kinds of things, only with the exponential distribution. Why do you do that? Well, it's easy. Okay. Do you ever tell anybody that it also rarely exists in the real world? This is an exercise of converting a PDF to a CDF using math, and you're avoiding doing any calculus. Is that what you're after here, or any complex calculus? Like, well, we got to get the concept across, right? Okay, I get that. How about you actually do it so that you leave your students in a place where they're not dangerous? And what do you mean? And we go into that. But it's incestuous. It's our books and teachings and all this stuff just harps on the exponential and uses MTTF and MTBF without that second layer of, well, what is it a accurate representation of what you're trying to model or measure or follow? That just baffles me to no end.
Well, let's not give professors too many dues. I mean, there was a time where you say someone's a professor, then obviously you knew they were very, very smart and at the top of their game. And that's not always the case. Having worked at a couple of universities, you go, oh my God, how the hell did you get in here? The number of, right. I mean, I think I'm trying to work out which one is my favorite professor being an idiot moment, but I'm not sure I have one.
I've got dozens. I've got dozens and dozens of them.
No. I have dozens, but I'm not sure what my favorite one is what I'm saying. Is that I think one was where I had a professor going through a Weibull plot of something, and it was based on real data. Mm-hmm. And he was adamant he could see 10 separate failure mechanisms because of the sort of what
wiggles
experienced practitioners would know. Yeah, just the natural variation. Oh, here's a little failure mechanism here for these 3 data points. You go, oh God, you have tenure. How the hell do you have tenure? How can you be unfireable? It's just bad. Professors, there is no ramification for them not knowing anything about what they're talking about. They are rewarded for being able to get content into articles, and that's a good topic to talk about because a number of retractions that's going on today, especially from the medical field, is just
I saw something a couple of months ago. Is just the number of articles submitted that were, when they ran them through AI detector type stuff, it was like 8 out of 10 were AI generated, and the data was too. It was like there's no substance here whatsoever.
Well, the other thing too is you'll see papers being written with like 16 authors. And you go, okay, so the 2 most junior people at best did all the work. They walked past the office of one. It was in a laboratory named after another person. There was someone who was inadvertently CC'd on an email, and therefore everyone's claiming a stake in these papers. And I was just reading, in particular, there's I think 2 very well-respected Australian cancer researchers, and their paper, which had their name on it, essentially showed images. And I had a look at. I sometimes enjoy looking at these papers, which has since been found to be essentially fraudulent. And you go, okay, so all they did was on image on the left, which is based on DNA sort of markers and stains and things like that.
Yeah.
And the image on the right was the image on the left turned upside down. It was, but they're supposed to be 2 completely different experiments. And there was, I think it was 6 authors in total, and 2 of them were these, senior stars, and they've both been reached for comment. None of them responded. I will guarantee you they had virtually nothing to do with the actual carrying out of the research. It was perhaps the more junior people, but because they were an advisor, or because of, they did this or did that, they want their name on the paper to
Or
get
they
their,
funded it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And of course now they don't have anything to say because they didn't check it, because they're just chasing
The next
the
publication date.
publications.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
back to that, the factory, when you're tracking it.
Did we get off track?
Well, a little bit, but it's the basic idea is that, if you've got a quality manager, and I've run into one in particular, that I just want the MTBF number. I got too many other things I got to look at, and I want reliability to be just one number. Then I can move on. And all right, so you want me just to lie to you about what's really happening in your factory? Basically, it reminded me of a
Right.
Dilbert cartoon. He's like, you want me to sum up a bunch of fictitious numbers so that you get a single number that has no meaning whatsoever, but you can understand it. And the boss goes, yes. I was thinking parts count prediction.
Yep.
But it's the idea is the measures or the metrics that get put in, and senior folks, they're busy. There's no doubt about it. Yet it doesn't abdicate them or relieve them of the responsibility to understand what's really going on, and having reasonable measures and measure indicators and charts and trends and whatever else. Yeah, it might be complex. Putting juice in a bottle in a factory at 2,000 a minute, that's a complex process. Sorry, I've seen that machine. It is just a mechanical marvel that anybody came up with this thing. It's using a simplified number is just, in my opinion, it's criminal, because you're just leading yourself to, you're enabling yourself to make really bad decisions. And then the blame game starts, and all kinds of other bad starts happening. So my bottom line, Chris, is I agree. There are technically valid reasons to have an MTBF value. They can be, in my opinion, they can be much more suitable replaced with other things that are easier to understand and won't be misrepresented or misunderstood. So what I find the justification to use it on technical grounds valid, yet in practical sense, it's impossible to get it right, to implement it.
I agree, but I think that's the answer we need to give people who ask the question, because when people ask the question, they're often coming from not a highly experienced place, and if they say, "Hang on, improving the MTBF is a good thing, so why is it not real? Why shouldn't we use it?" They're 100% correct in the premise of their question. But we then need to go on and say, just so you know, the MTBF often spreads like a contagion. And so even though you might have the MTBF as some sort of high-level indicator, much like mass of a human being is linked to health, but of itself doesn't answer all the questions.
Yeah.
Once you have it there, for whatever reason, engineers just have it go down to every single thing they do. And you can't do that. Ball bearing example being one. Same ball bearing, same MTBF. And you just can't
we
do
got to
it.
come up with a little swag, like this little breath mint type tins with little mints in it. And on them is stamped the no MTBF logo. So if somebody starts talking about MTBF, you give them a pill to say, here, you'll get over it if you have this.
That's right.
Inoculate them against it or something.
Well, of course, if you like making money in your plans, that'll help. But yeah, I just think that we often have to go one step further, because engineers who ask the questions, they're not always idiots. And if we don't explain why you can't use it from a practical sense, even though theoretically there is some justification to be had, and that's when we run into problems, I would argue.
Yep. So if you're dealing with MTBF or MTTF or MTBUR or one of the other 4,000 variants of it that are all so contrived, nobody really knows what they mean, that, let us know. How's it going? How have you broken through? How have you made a difference and getting real understanding going and those kinds of things? And if you'd like to take the idea of making, breath mints with the no MTBF logo stamped on them, I'd be happy to share the logo with you. And I think it would be a next step up in swag from the no MTBF buttons. But let us know. Head over to accendoreliability.com/go/SOR. And there's a couple of ways to get in touch with you. And we did get a SpeakPipe message the other day. Carl and I are scheduled to talk about it here soon. So we know that system works, and it was really kind of cool. And good questions. I'm looking forward to that. Chris and I and the other hosts of the show are available through LinkedIn and our About pages. So please do send over your comments or questions or ideas. We're always are looking for those, and look forward to talking to you or seeing you, listening. I don't know what the right term is, talking at you in a podcast in a couple of days. So with that, Chris, yeah, he still didn't convince me completely. I'd still say no.
No, I'm with you, but at least you got to give context when we're saying no. That's all I'm saying.
That's true. I get that. All right. Thanks, Chris. Talk to you soon.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Speaking of Reliability. We invite you to join the conversation. If you have a question or a topic that you think we should discuss in a future show, please let us know. You can find a comment box below the episode show notes, or just leave a note as part of a review on iTunes.